The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Margaret Walsh moved through Seattle General's ICU with the kind of invisibility that comes from 23 years of practice, not the invisibility of being overlooked, but the invisibility of being beneath notice. She checked vital signs on room 401, documented on room 402, adjusted and drip on room 403 without making eye contact with the residents who passed her in the hallway. They moved around her the way water moves around a stone. She was the old nurse. The one who didn't ask questions. The one who knew where everything was and never complained about the schedule. The one they could ignore. Her left leg ached. It always did when the weather shifted. The scars underneath her scrub collar itched, a habit she'd developed years ago, pressing her fingertips against that particular spot when stress built up in her shoulders. But her hand stayed steady. That was the rule she'd made with herself on the day she'd gotten her civilian nursing license. Hand steady. Eyes forward. No trembling. She paused outside room 404. The new admission. The intake nurse had flagged it as trauma, unconscious, being moved from the ICU at Walter Reed due to specialized neurology needs. Admiral Robert Chen. 51 years old. Traumatic brain injury sustained in a motor vehicle accident. Morphine drip at 8 mg per hour. Sedated. Expected to remain unconscious for 72 hours minimum. The name meant nothing to anyone else. The tattoo on his left arm meant everything. Margaret stared at the ink for exactly 3 seconds. Military stencil font. Precise. Professional. The kind of tattoo that didn't advertise itself. It had been placed high on his inner arm, visible only if someone was looking deliberately, or if his arm was bare above the sheet like it was now. M. Walsh in letters the color of old silver. She had carried him through gunfire 3 years ago. She had carried him for 3 miles through the streets of Tikrit with 2 rounds of shrapnel in her left leg and 1 in her right, his weight on her back like a second body, his blood soaking through her uniform, his voice, unconscious but still breathing, the only reason she didn't stop, didn't sit down, didn't give the infection time to set in. He looked directly at her. His eyes were unfocused, morphine-glazed, the pupils blown wide. No recognition. Nothing. Just a sedated patient waiting for the neurologist's evaluation. Margaret turned away and finished her rounds. At 0800, Dr. Caldwell arrived for rounds. He moved through the ward like a man who owned it, expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, phone already in his other hand, Italian loafers clicking against the tile with a rhythm like a heartbeat. His voice preceded him into each room, already talking before he was fully through the doorway, addressing residents and interns who scrambled to keep pace with his gait and his words. He was the kind of surgeon who made hospital corridors smaller just by walking through them. The staff deferred. The nurses stepped aside. The equipment seemed to arrange itself in his presence. His eyes found Margaret outside room 404. She was entering vitals into the digital chart, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the touch screen. She didn't look up. She had learned not to look up. Looking up acknowledged a presence. Looking up invited conversation. Looking up reminded people that she was there. Caldwell paused. His residents kept moving, but he stopped. He stood in the doorway of room 404 and watched her work. It wasn't a glance. It was sustained attention. It was the kind of focus a predator uses when it has identified prey and is calculating distance, speed, angles of attack. Margaret felt it the way animals feel weather shifts, a change in air pressure, a subtle shift in electromagnetic field. She continued documenting. Heart rate 62. Blood pressure 118/74. Oxygen saturation 97% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Glasgow Coma Scale 7. Sedation appropriate for traumatic brain injury protocol. Everything adequate. Caldwell's voice was smooth. It sounded like a tank idling in a distant garage, powerful, dangerous, controlled. Documentation complete for the hour, Doctor. Margaret's voice was deferential. Soft. a tone she had perfected over 23 years. It was the voice of someone who understood hierarchy and accepted it as natural law. He didn't move. One of his residents appeared in the hallway, confused about where the doctor had gone. Caldwell held up one hand, a gesture that meant wait, be still, don't interrupt this. He was still watching Margaret. His gaze moved from her hands, which had held lives together, which had been steady under fire in a classified operation in Tikrit that officially never happened, to her face, which was carefully blank, and then down to her feet, where her right leg bore her weight slightly differently than her left, the kind of postural adjustment that was invisible to most people but screamed military compensation pattern to anyone who knew what to look for. "You've been here long?" he asked. 7 years in this unit, Doctor. Prior nursing experience in military hospitals. She kept her eyes on the chart. 23 years total. And you've never considered moving into a supervisory role? There it was. The question was a test. Everything after this would be weighted. I prefer patient care, Doctor. Direct contribution. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile a surgeon makes when he's about to open someone up and explain to the medical students what he's going to do before he does it, professional, controlled, containing absolutely no warmth. Some people just aren't cut out for medicine at this level, he said, and then he turned and walked away, his resident scrambling to follow him, the moment evaporating like water on hot pavement. Margaret continued documenting. Admiral Chen. Room for 04. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than it had that morning. That afternoon, she pulled the billing codes. It was part of her job. Nurses in the ICU were responsible for flagging any documentation that didn't match treatment provided. Insurance companies paid differently depending on how procedures were coded, and accuracy mattered. The system was supposed to work like a check on fraud. Margaret had never needed to use it as an actual check before. She documented thousands of procedures. Every one had been legitimate. Every one had matched what was actually provided to patients. Caldwell's procedures didn't match. She found the pattern in 3 cardiac catheterizations over 2 weeks. All of them for patients who didn't present with cardiac symptoms. All of them resulting in normal angiography, no blockage, no stenosis, no pathological findings. All of them billed as complex interventional cases despite being diagnostic-only procedures that took 37 minutes, 41 minutes, and 39 minutes respectively. All of them referring to equipment purchased through a company called Meridian Surgical Solutions, registered to an address in Scottsdale, Arizona that cross-referenced to a DBA under the name Catherine Brennan Caldwell. Catherine. The doctor's wife's maiden name was Brennan. The brother-in-law connection took 5 minutes of public records research. Margaret sat in the break room at 11:45 p.m., a shift 7 hours from ending, and stared at the documentation on her personal laptop. She had done this before, not the research, not the investigation, but the recognition. She had recognized the pattern. The corruption pattern. The systemic pattern. In Tikrit, she had recognized threat patterns. In combat, you recognized patterns in breathing, in the way a hand moved toward fabric, in the weight distribution of someone preparing to fire. Your brain recorded the data automatically. Your hands responded without consulting your conscious mind. She closed the laptop. She would report it through channels. That's what the system said to do. That's what the hospital policy mandated. Report through your supervisor. Document the concern. Let the institution handle it. But institutions had a way of protecting their own. And Caldwell was the kind of surgeon who made hospitals money. $14 million a year in billable procedures. $14 million that meant new wings, new equipment, recruitment bonuses, reputation. That was a lot of institutional protection. She reached into her scrub pocket and felt the challenge coin. It was the size of a quarter, heavier than it should be, made from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel from the operation in Tikrit, the operation that officially never happened. The coin had 3 people's names engraved on one side and coordinates on the other. Only 5 people had ever known those coordinates. 2 of them were dead. 2 of them had disappeared into classified assignments around the world. And one of them was lying sedated in room 404 with her name tattooed on his arm. The tarnished surface caught the fluorescent light. Margaret put the coin back in her pocket and finished her shift at 0600 without reporting anything. She would think about it. She would plan it properly. She had 23 years of experience at being invisible, at being forgotten, at moving through institutions without leaving traces. But now something had shifted. The man in room 404 had shifted it. She drove home through Atlanta traffic with the windows down, her left leg aching, her hand steady on the steering wheel. The morning light caught the scars on her neck. She remembered Tikrit. She remembered the weight of him. She remembered the day the Navy had called her into a room with 3 admirals and told her that Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh needed to disappear, that her service record was being classified to the level of special access programs, that she would be medically separated with honors and would never speak of what happened in the Jolon district. They had given her a civilian nursing license, a social security number that was legally hers but felt like a costume, and a warning: if she ever acknowledged her prior service, it would invalidate her medical license and result in federal charges for disclosure of classified operations. She had accepted the erasure. Now the past was waking up in room 404, and the system that had erased her was protecting a fraud, and Margaret Walsh had to decide whether to stay invisible or step into the light. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Admiral Chen would be moved out of her unit within 72 hours. The neurology team would stabilize him, and then he would be transferred to Walter Reed or Bethesda Naval Medical Center. He would be moved into a military medical facility where she couldn't reach him, where she couldn't protect him, where Caldwell's reach might or might not extend. And then she would never know if he lived or died, if he recovered or remained trapped in the liminal space between consciousness and coma where he currently existed. She had 48 hours to decide. The conference room fell silent when Dr. Caldwell projected Margaret's charting onto the overhead screen. 12 residents leaned forward in their seats, pens poised like weapons, ready to document the inadequacy he was about to demonstrate. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical judgment overhead as Margaret stood at the back of the room, her hands folded in front of her the way she'd learned to stand in Tikrit, present but invisible, the way ghosts learn to breathe. "Class," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man about to perform an execution, "this is what inadequate documentation standards look like." He moved to the projection, laser pointer in hand, and began circling entries that didn't contain errors. Margaret watched him work with the precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of the lie. "See this timing discrepancy? Vague. Incomplete. A patient could die because another provider can't interpret this nurse's notes." The cursor hovered over a vitals entry Margaret had recorded at 0847 that morning, perfectly timed, perfectly documented, the oxygen saturation and heart rate captured in the exact sequence they'd occurred. There was no discrepancy. But Caldwell circled it anyway, his movements deliberate and slow, giving the residents time to write down the fabrication. Margaret felt the weight of 14 eyes on her back. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hand stayed steady. "Come up here, Margaret," Caldwell said, his tone dropping into the register he used for people he'd already decided were beneath him. "Let's talk about what professional documentation actually requires." She moved through the room without rushing, without the apologetic shuffle he'd come to expect from her. 3 years of being invisible meant she could move like a shadow, efficient, purposeful, unobtrusive. When she reached the front, she turned to face him and the assembled residents. Caldwell's smile widened. He was enjoying this. "How long have you been a nurse, Margaret?" He asked it like he was offering her a chance to explain her own inadequacy. "Maybe it's time to consider a less demanding unit. Something more suited to your current capabilities." She didn't respond. Didn't defend herself. Didn't argue. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind of restraint a person learns when they've spent 3 tours holding the line between life and death, when they've been erased from every database and told to disappear into ordinary life, when they carry a challenge coin in their scrub pocket that's the only proof they ever existed at all. She simply nodded and returned to her position at the back of the room while Caldwell continued his performance, itemizing errors that existed only in his carefully constructed narrative. Later that afternoon, Margaret passed the vending machines on the 3rd floor. 2 residents she recognized from Grand Round stood against the wall, their voices low but not low enough. The taller one, she'd seen him twice in the ICU, always rushing, always certain, laughed in a way that made her pause in the corridor beyond their line of sight. "Did you see Caldwell destroy that old nurse?" he said. "She actually thinks she knows better than physicians. Somebody needs to remind her what RN stands for, really nothing." The 2nd resident joined in, a lower laugh that sounded like gravel. Margaret stood motionless, her hand on the medication cart, and felt something inside her go very still. Not anger. Not humiliation. The specific kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She thought of Sergeant Holloway, who'd taken shrapnel meant for her in Fallujah. She thought of the 3 Marines she'd carried out on the same night, their blood soaking through her utility uniform like rain. She thought of the moment the Pentagon had told her to stop existing, to bury Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh 7,000 feet underwater and walk around as just a nurse instead. She continued past the vending machines without changing her pace. Didn't lower her eyes. Didn't acknowledge them. The residents didn't notice her at all. That evening, Margaret sat in the charting station and pulled Admiral Chen's file. The folder was thin, he was only 3 days post-op from the initial admission, but what lived in those pages made her hands move slowly through the records. 3 cardiac catheterizations. 3 days. All ordered by Caldwell. All performed using equipment from Thoracic Innovations LLC, the model currently listed in inventory with a serial number that matched the supplies cart in the OR. She cross-referenced the company. Pulled up the corporate board. Found the name in 30 seconds, James Caldwell, MD, spouse's brother, Robert Caldwell, Vice President of Sales, Thoracic Innovations LLC. The conflict of interest was so obvious that she almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she printed the documentation and studied the progression of orders. The first catheterization had been clinically indicated. The Admiral's admission EKG showed borderline ST elevation in the lateral leads. The second one 2 days later made less sense, but could have been justified by inconclusive results. The third one, ordered this morning, had no clinical basis whatsoever. The previous catheterization had shown clean coronaries. The ejection fraction was normal. The troponin levels were dropping. This wasn't medicine. This was banking. Margaret found Dr. Caldwell in the hallway outside the ICU at 18:45, just before evening rounds. He was writing notes on a clipboard, his movements efficient and distracted, the body language of a man who'd already moved on to his next patient, his next opportunity. She kept her voice low and steady. "The 3rd cardiac catheterization," she said. "It's not clinically indicated." Caldwell looked up slowly. His eyes went very still. "I'm sorry. Admiral Chen's coronaries are patent. His ejection fraction is adequate. His troponin is trending down. There's no clinical reason for another catheterization." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Caldwell stepped closer, into her personal space, using his height and his proximity like weapons. His voice dropped to something that sounded like a knife being drawn across marble. "Question my clinical judgment again," he said, "and I'll have security escort you out of this building for insubordination. Do you understand me, Margaret?" She met his eyes. Held them for a breath. Then nodded once and walked back to the medication station without another word. Her hands were steady as she logged the cardiac catheterization order into the system at 18:47, her signature beneath his in the authorization field, the digital marker of her compliance. The medication cart rolled smoothly beneath her fingers. Muscle memory took over. She'd logged 1,000 questionable orders in her career, all before she'd learned to recognize what they meant. But now she could see the pattern, and the pattern made her furious in a way that went deeper than words. That night, Margaret stared at her bathroom mirror and saw the face of the woman she wasn't supposed to be anymore. the woman she'd buried 3 years ago when the Navy had decided that Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had become a liability, that her classified extraction of Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen from Tikrit, the operation that officially never happened, had created complications that required erasure. She'd been honorably discharged into a new social security number, a new name on the nursing license, a new identity in a city where no one would ask questions about why a woman with her qualifications was working ICU shifts for $34 an hour. The bathroom light flickered. She remembered carrying Chen 3 miles through the streets of Old Tikrit, remembered the weight of him on her back, remembered the sound of gunfire passing so close it seemed to part the air like water. She remembered the moment she'd set him down in the extraction zone, his blood soaking through her uniform, and the Black Hawk pilot who'd told her to stand back while they loaded him aboard. She remembered watching the aircraft lift off and rise into the darkness, carrying away the only person who could ever prove that she'd been real. And now he was 3 floors above her, sedated and intubated, with her name tattooed on his arm in faded blue ink that meant everything and nothing to a man in a morphine haze who no longer remembered her face. She thought about the 48 hours she'd given herself to decide, the deadline she'd set without knowing if she had the right to make that choice at all. She thought about Caldwell's hand shaking slightly when he'd stepped into her space, the way his voice had taken on that particular timbre of desperation disguised as authority. He was smart. She could give him that. He was intelligent enough to recognize a threat and competent enough to understand that she was one. But he had no idea what kind of threat he actually stood across from. The challenge coin was on the bathroom counter, where she'd left it this morning. Tarnished silver, worn smooth by 30 years of hands before hers and 3 years of hers before that. On one side, the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command. On the other, 3 words that nobody official ever spoke anymore, Master Chief Walsh. Tikrit. She picked it up and felt the weight of it in her palm, not heavy, but dense with meaning in a way that ordinary metal couldn't capture. This was the only proof that any of it had been real. In the morning, she would return to Seattle General. She would log medications and check vitals and maintain the practiced invisibility that had become the shape of her life. She would watch Dr. Caldwell order a 3rd procedure on a patient who didn't need it, and she would know, with absolute certainty, that the line between who she had been and who she was pretending to be had just become dangerously thin. The 2 residents by the vending machines had no idea. Caldwell had no idea. None of them understood that they were standing in the presence of someone who had already survived things designed to kill her, someone who'd been trained to recognize lethal patterns and respond with precision. They thought she was just a nurse. They had no idea who they were standing next to. The monitor alarm cut through the quiet like a blade. 0200 hours. Margaret was 3 rooms down, checking a post-op vital sheet, when the sound registered, not the steady beep of a resting patient, but the staccato pattern of a system in distress. She moved before conscious thought could slow her down. Muscle memory. The kind that lives in bone. Admiral Chen's room was cool and blue-lit, the ventilator's rhythmic hiss the only sound until she stepped inside. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 89, 87. The monitor showed muffled heart sounds, the telemetry was picking up the electrical signal, but the mechanical force behind it was failing. She ran her eyes across his neck. The jugular vein stood out like cords, distended against the skin. His blood pressure had fallen from 118 to 94 in the last 6 minutes. The clinical picture assembled itself in her mind with the same precision she'd used to disassemble a rifle blindfolded, Beck's triad. Hypertension. Jugular venous distension. Muffled heart sounds. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating in the space around the heart, compressing it, strangling it. The man whose name was tattooed on his forearm was dying in front of her, and the clock was already running. She didn't call for help. Not yet. She moved to the bedside and began assembling the tray, the sterile field, the betadine swabs, the 18-gauge needle that would be her only language in the next 30 seconds. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. The antiseptic smell of the prep solution rose up, sharp and clean. She positioned Admiral Chen on his back, located the xiphoid process, that small notch of bone at the base of his sternum, and marked her entry site. 2 centimeters superior. 45-degree angle. The needle would pass through skin, fascia, and the pericardial membrane before it reached the fluid that was killing him. She didn't think about scope of practice. She didn't think about the 5 years of nursing school or the 3 years since that night in Tikrit when the Navy had erased her from every database and told her to disappear into civilian life. She thought about Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen's weight on her back during the extraction. She thought about 3 miles through gunfire. She thought about the man he'd become, Admiral now, his left arm bearing her name in permanent ink, as if he'd been carrying a promise in reverse all these years. She thought about none of that. She thought only about the next breath. The needle went in. The pericardial membrane gave way with the faintest resistance, like breaking through the surface of still water. She advanced the catheter, felt the give, and then the hiss. The hiss of air and fluid escaping under pressure. A syringe. Blood. Dark red. 60 milliliters in the first withdrawal. His blood pressure began to tick upward. 96, 99. The oxygen saturation climbed. 88, 90. 92. The heart sounds on the monitor became clearer, the murmur resolving into distinct S1 and S2 beats. Evidence. The code team started moving outside her door. Someone had noticed. Someone had sent the alert. She could hear the commotion building, feet, voices, the sound of a crash cart being wheeled down the hallway. She kept her hand steady. Another 40 milliliters into the collection bag. The bag was filling with blood that had no business being there, blood that had been stealing oxygen from Admiral Chen's brain 1 milliliter at a time. The first doctor arrived at 0205. Dr. Sinclair, a cardiologist with 15 years and a reputation for caution. He stopped in the doorway, saw what she was doing, and his face went pale. "Stop," he said. "Not a question. Not a request. An order. You need to stop right now." Margaret didn't stop. She didn't even look at him. She withdrew another syringe full. "I said stop." He moved toward the bed, but something in her posture, the way she was positioned, the absolute concentration on her face, made him hesitate. "What the hell are you doing?" "Draining the tamponade," Margaret said. 2 doctors arrived at the door. 3. The hallway was filling with people. Her voice remained flat. "Informational. He's crashing. He needs this." "That's not your procedure to perform," Sinclair said, his voice rising. "You're a floor nurse. Step back. Now." She didn't step back. For more doctors crowded into the room, their voices overlapping. Scope of practice. Liability. Who authorized this? The attending physician. The interventional cardiologist. The chief of cardiology. They were right, technically. A registered nurse performing a pericardiocentesis was a violation of protocol so complete it had its own section in the hospital bylaws. Margaret had read those bylaws 3 times. She knew exactly how much trouble this was. She continued anyway, because Admiral Chen's oxygen sat was 94 now, and rising. "Get her away from the patient," someone said. "No one touch her," someone else countered. "I want to see what happens." The monitor beeped. The rhythm was steadier. The muffled heart sounds had cleared into something resembling normal. The evidence bag filled with another 60 milliliters of blood that had been drowning him from the inside. By 02:15, all 15 of the overnight shift's attending physicians had crowded into room 404. The room itself felt smaller, the air pressure changing with so many bodies, so many voices. 15 doctors objecting, all at once, a chorus of liability concerns and protocol violations and careers at risk. "This is a crime," someone said. "This is malpractice," someone else countered. "Her license is done. Hospital's insurance is going to have a field day." Margaret held pressure on the catheter site. She didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, holding the only thing that mattered, Admiral Chen's life, measured in the rising number on the oxygen saturation monitor. 96, 97. 98, his blood pressure stabilized at 112/68. His heart rate dropped from the 140s into the 90s. His pupils remained reactive. The man who had carried her into a classified operation across 3 time zones was breathing steadier now, his body no longer starving for oxygen. The door opened wider. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 0223, still in street clothes, his phone already raised to his ear. She heard him in the hallway before she saw him. Heard him say her name with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "She's performing unauthorized procedures," he said into the phone. Someone on the other end was listening. Someone important. Someone with authority over licenses and livelihoods. She could hear the timbre of his voice change, the sound of a man laying a trap that had finally sprung. His contact at the state licensing board. His contact in administration. People were being called. Paperwork was being initiated. The consequences were materializing in real time. But Admiral Chen's vitals were stable. The collection bag held evidence of the fluid that had nearly killed him, blood that shouldn't have been there, blood that could only have come from the repeated catheterizations, the 3 unnecessary procedures ordered in 3 days. Caldwell's procedures. Caldwell's billing. Caldwell's equipment company kickbacks through his wife's brother. Margaret looked down at Admiral Chen's arm, at the tattoo, and something in her chest tightened like a fist. She opened her mouth to say it. To explain the connection. To tell them that the procedures had caused the tamponade, that the unnecessary interventions had nearly killed him, that the pattern she'd been documenting on her own time for 3 weeks had just proven itself in blood and evidence. "Don't," Caldwell said. His voice was quiet now. The worst kind of quiet, the voice of someone who no longer needs to shout because he already knows his one. "Don't you dare say another word." The security guards arrived at 0247. 2 of them, in the grey uniforms of the hospital's private detail. Caldwell pointed at her without looking away from his phone call. They approached the bed like she was already gone. Margaret secured the catheter one final time, documented the procedure with clinical precision, time, indication, output, vitals, and then she stepped back from Admiral Chen's bedside. Her badge was in her pocket. The tarnished challenge coin was in her other pocket, the one from Tikrit, from the night the Navy had told her to disappear and never come back. She touched it once, the way a sailor touches a compass before a storm, and then she turned toward the door. The security guards walked her down the hallway at a measured pace. Neither of them spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent. Her badge was deactivated before she reached the parking lot. She heard the system beep as the reader rejected it, as her access to every door, every room, every corner of the hospital erased itself in an instant. Just like before. Just like Tikrit. Just like the night Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had been formally discharged from a military that wanted to forget she'd ever existed. She drove home in silence, the parking lot lights falling away behind her, her hand still steady on the wheel. Caldwell arrived at 0230, in street clothes, his tie loosened but his phone already raised to his ear before he cleared the trauma bay doors. Margaret was still applying pressure to the catheter site, Admiral Chen's cardiac output stabilizing on the monitor, 88% oxygen saturation now, climbing steady, but Caldwell's voice cut through the beeping like a scalpel. He didn't look at the patient. He looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who'd finally found the thread he needed to pull everything apart. He turned and walked into the hallway. His footsteps echoed against the tile, and Margaret heard him punch a number with the precision of someone who'd memorized it years ago. The first call came through almost immediately. A board member's sleepy voice, then Caldwell's voice growing sharper, more animated. "I need to report a serious scope of practice violation." A nurse, Margaret Walsh, ICU staff, performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. 15 doctors on shift. None of them sanctioned this. A pause. Yes, all 15 objected. Actively objected. She proceeded anyway. Another pause, longer this time. I have documentation. She's already been removed from duty. Margaret's hands didn't shake. Pain is information. Control is everything. She kept the catheter steady, watching the blood drain into the collection chamber, watching the patient's heart rate normalize on the monitor. One beat at a time. The next beat was a victory. The second call came 30 seconds later. The nursing director's home number. Caldwell's voice had shifted now, carrying that particular satisfaction of a man who'd finally found the right lever. Director, Dr. Caldwell. I'm reporting a critical incident. A nurse working under my supervision performed an invasive procedure at 0200 hours without authorization, in direct violation of hospital protocol. All 15 physicians present objected. All 15. She refused to stop. His voice was almost conversational, almost friendly, the voice of someone reporting a regrettable tragedy rather than fabricating one. I've already contacted board administration. I wanted to ensure you heard this from me first. Professional courtesy. Margaret could hear the nursing director's muffled response, even from inside the trauma bay. The tone had shifted from sleepy irritation to fully alert panic. The third call was the one that sealed it. The state licensing board contact, Caldwell, had said the name once, months ago, at a hospital function where Margaret had been wiping down the beverage station. The contact answered on the second ring, which meant this wasn't the first call of the night between them, which meant this was already in motion, already planned, already weaponized and waiting. It's Dr. Caldwell. I need to file a formal complaint against a nurse for practicing beyond her scope. This is documented. 15 physician witnesses. She performed an unauthorized pericardiocentesis at 0200 hours. I have the time-stamped monitor recordings. I have the nursing notes. A pause. Yes, I'm willing to testify. No, this isn't her first violation. There's a pattern of insubordination, of overstepping, of, yes, I believe her license should be suspended pending investigation. Thank you. I'll have the documentation to you by morning. The phone went silent. Margaret finished securing the catheter. Admiral Chen's vitals were stable. The work was done. The patient would live. The pericardiocentesis had been textbook, the needle angle precise, the catheter placement exact, the fluid evacuation complete. Everything she'd trained for, everything she'd kept hidden, everything she'd done in service to something larger than protocol or policy or the fragile egos of physicians, it had all worked. It had all worked, and it had cost her everything. Security arrived at 0247, two officers who'd been given explicit instructions not to make eye contact, not to acknowledge that they'd worked the same shifts as Margaret for 3 years. One of them was Morrison, who'd asked her advice 6 months ago about his daughter's fever. Margaret had recognized the symptoms of early meningitis and told him to get her to the ER immediately. His daughter had survived. He didn't look at Margaret now. Your badge, Morrison said quietly. Margaret slid it across the counter. The laminated ID with her photo, her name, her authorization to walk these halls, to touch these patients, to exist in this place, gone. Morrison's hand reached out, and Margaret watched her identity deactivated with the press of a button on the computer terminal. The magnetic strip lost its signal. The access codes disappeared. She was no longer a nurse at Seattle General Hospital in Atlanta. She was no longer anyone at all. The parking lot lights reflected off the rain-slicked asphalt like fallen stars. Margaret walked without speaking, without looking back, without letting the silence break her. Her hands had been steady through the entire crisis. They remained steady now as she gripped the steering wheel, as she pulled out of the employee lot and onto the empty 0200 streets of Atlanta, as she drove through red lights that nobody cared about at this hour because the city was sleeping and she was leaving it. The car was silent except for the sound of the windshield wipers, the steady thump-thump-thump of rubber against glass, the white noise of survival. Margaret's scrubs were still damp with sweat and saline solution. The challenge coin was heavy in her pocket, the tarnished brass circle that weighed more than physics should allow, that contained 3 years of secrets in its oxidized surface, that held the face of a man she'd saved in a desert 3,000 miles away and 2 lifetimes ago. She drove for 45 minutes with no destination, just motion, just the necessity of moving forward because stopping would mean feeling the thing she couldn't afford to feel. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery. Eventually, the car found its way home, the apartment on Morningside Drive, the small 3-bedroom where she'd built a life so deliberately invisible that it barely existed at all. Margaret parked in the driveway and didn't move. The engine ticked as it cooled. The rain hammered the roof like applause for a performance that had just ended. She sat behind the steering wheel in her damp scrubs, the challenge coin pressed into her palm, and waited for something, for anger, for fear, for the collapse that should have come hours ago when the first doctor told her to stop, when she'd kept working anyway, when she'd crossed the line between following orders and being someone who couldn't follow orders anymore. But there was nothing. Just the sound of rain and the weight of the coin and the knowledge that she'd done everything right and it hadn't mattered because doing everything right means nothing when the system decides you don't belong in it. She didn't remember walking inside. She didn't remember sitting at the kitchen table. But when the sun came up, when the Atlanta morning bled grey and reluctant through the kitchen window, and the coffee maker sat on the counter untouched, and her daughter's bedroom door was still closed because Emily was only 9 and didn't wake until 0800, Margaret realized that 6 hours had passed and she hadn't moved. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her face was wet. The tears were running soundlessly down her cheeks, the kind of tears that don't make noise because they're not about emotion anymore, they're about biology, about the body processing what the mind refuses to accept. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't move. She just sat in her scrubs, still damp with another man's blood, and waited for the day to demand something from her that she no longer had the capacity to give. The sound of small feet on the hardwood floor came first. Emily's voice, still thick with sleep, confused and uncertain in a way that meant she already sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her world. "Mommy." Margaret looked up. Her daughter stood in the kitchen doorway wearing the pajamas Margaret had bought her last month, purple with white stars, and her hair was tangled from sleep and her eyes were still half closed until she saw her mother's face clearly and something inside her froze. "Why aren't you at work?" Emily asked. Her voice was small. Frightened. "Why are you crying?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer. The words wouldn't come. There was nothing to say that a 9-year-old could understand, nothing that would explain why the woman who'd carried a Navy admiral through gunfire and out of a desert had been removed from a hospital for saving his life. Emily crossed the kitchen and climbed into her lap without being asked. Her daughter smelled like sleep and the strawberry shampoo Margaret used on her hair on Saturday nights. She smelled like normal life, like the thing Margaret had been trying to build all this time by being invisible, by being quiet, by being no one. "Did something bad happen?" Emily whispered. Margaret held her and nodded. "I saved someone, baby. And they fired me for it." The phone rang 40 minutes later. Then again. Then again. Each call a voice confirming what she already knew: termination effective immediately, investigation pending, license suspension recommended, references called, future employment already poisoned before she could even apply. Margaret didn't answer. She held her daughter and watched the morning become afternoon, and somewhere in that grey transition, she realized that the only thread holding her to this civilian life had just snapped. The phone call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after security had deactivated her badge. Margaret was at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier, watching Emily's school backpack sit by the door, when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized. Seattle General's main line. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Ms. Walsh, this is Administrative Services. We have your personal effects ready for pickup. Your shift locker was cleared per termination protocol. Items are available between 1400 and 1800 hours today, or we can arrange courier delivery." The voice was neutral, institutional, the way hospitals spoke to former employees who had become liability vectors rather than people. Margaret said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, "I'll pick them up." She drove to Seattle General at 1400 exactly, wearing jeans and a grey sweater instead of scrubs, her appearance so deliberately civilian it felt like a disguise. The parking lot was the same asphalt, same rain-stained light poles, same staff arriving and leaving through the ambulance bay, but her body recognized the shift in gravity, the way certain places hold the weight of what happened there. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She signed in at the visitor desk with her civilian name, took the temporary badge the receptionist offered without meeting her eyes, and walked toward the administrative office on the 3rd floor. The corridor stretched ahead like a vein, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular hospital pallor. Her feet knew this path. For years of feet, walking these halls, reading monitors, holding dying people's hands while their families wept in chairs they'd sat in for 14 hours. Feet that had walked through Tikrit carrying 243 pounds of armor and ammunition and fear. These feet had carried her through so much. Today they carried her toward a cardboard box. But that wasn't what stopped her. The transport team came around the corner at exactly 14:13, moving with the controlled urgency of a patient transfer. Stretcher, portable monitor, for lines already running. And on the stretcher, a man maybe 60, maybe older, dark eyes open and alert, his left arm positioned carefully at his side where the hand should have been. The eyes found her. Locked. Stayed. Recognition moved through his face like electricity. His body went rigid against the stretcher straps. Then his voice came, not loud at first, then building, carrying through the hallway in a language that most people on this floor would not understand but that Margaret heard as clearly as if he were screaming it directly into her sternum. Al-Daiba. Al-Daiba. The wolf. The wolf. Margaret did not move. She did not flinch. She did not let her breathing change. She simply stood in that corridor while the transport team froze mid-stride and a handful of staff stopped walking and turned toward the sound, toward the patient shouting in Arabic, toward the older woman in civilian clothes whose entire body had just become a transmission of something they couldn't read but could absolutely sense. The veteran security guard, the one Margaret had never spoken to but who'd always nodded at her, who wore his Ramadi deployment patch under his uniform jacket, went absolutely rigid. His parade ground voice cut through everything, not loud but absolute, the kind of voice that made every single person in earshot stop breathing. Master Chief on deck. 3 words. The entire hallway crystallized into something else. Staff froze mid-step. A resident dropped a tablet. A nurse reaching for a medication cart let her hand fall. The transport team looked between the shouting patient and Margaret watched the equation solve itself across every face, recognition, then recalibration, then understanding that something they had fundamentally misread was now revealing its true shape. Dr. Caldwell was 20 feet away, standing with a medication chart in his hands. Margaret saw him first recognize the disturbance, then locate her in the chaos, then watch the veteran security guard place himself at a position of attention, actual military attention, shoulders back, spine straight, in the middle of a hospital hallway. She watched understanding move through Caldwell's face like a stage light sweeping across features, and then something else, the recognition of catastrophic miscalculation. His mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. The medication chart trembled. The hospital administrator arrived within the hour. Not a hospital person. A Navy Rear Admiral, uniform dress blues, rank on his shoulders, the kind of person who moved through spaces and altered the air pressure in them. He found Margaret in a conference room where she'd been directed to wait, and he closed the door behind himself with the kind of deliberate quietness that meant he was about to change everything. He didn't sit down. He opened a classified file, redacted sections blacked out with markers and official stamps, and he read aloud. His voice was measured, each word placed with precision. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 3 bronze stars. Pause. Every eye in the room shifted. 2 purple hearts. Longer pause. Someone's breath caught audibly. Operations in 4 theaters. Tikrit. Fallujah. Kandahar. Helmand Province. Final assignment listed as, he paused, deliberately. Classified. Security clearance revoked post-operation, direct order to maintain civilian cover and avoid disclosure of service record. Effective immediately, all prior service records sealed per OPSEC protocol. The Admiral closed the file. You were ordered to disappear, Master Chief. You followed orders. And for that, you were prosecuted by the very system you served. Then Admiral Chen arrived in his hospital bed. They wheeled him into the conference room, conscious now, eyes clear, the medication fog burned away by something that looked like pure focused rage. He lifted his left arm. Showed them the tattoo. Margaret's name in ink on his skin, right over the place where his heart beat. She took shrapnel in both legs carrying me out, he said, his voice steady as a surgical laser. Then went back for 2 more Marines. Insurgent fire. She didn't hesitate. The room held 10 seconds of absolute silence. 10 seconds where every person present understood that they had been standing next to a legend and calling her just a nurse. The State Board investigation that Caldwell had initiated, the one designed to destroy her, to erase her, to prove that a woman without credentials had dared to contradict a physician, shifted its focus entirely. The board cross-referenced dates. They discovered Margaret had been operating under direct military orders prohibiting disclosure. A pericardiocentesis performed by someone trained at Fort Sam Houston's Combat Trauma Training Center? Within scope. Far more than within scope. The board then examined Caldwell's records more carefully. They found everything. Admiral Chen's 3 cardiac catheterizations in 3 days, none medically indicated, all using Thoracic Innovations equipment. Then 18 more cases. 23 total, spanning 7 years. Procedures performed without informed consent. Billing codes inflated. Kickbacks totaling $340,000, funneled through his wife's brother's company. Wire transfers. Email chains. Everything that criminal enterprises need to exist documented in plain sight because Caldwell had never imagined that anyone would look. Caldwell's brother-in-law turned state's evidence. The medical board revoked his license. Federal prosecutors filed wire fraud charges. Seattle General terminated him quietly and settled with affected patients under strict non-disclosure agreements. The network Caldwell had built, board connections, insurance contacts, the people he'd called to destroy Margaret, collapsed like a structure whose foundation had been systematically exposed. Margaret watched it happen from a distance. She didn't attend hearings. She didn't give statements. She simply knew, the way information moves through hospital hallways, that his office had been cleared, that his name had been removed from the directory, that the people who'd taken his calls were now not taking them at all. 6 weeks after the revelation, her lawyer sent her a photograph. Caldwell outside a strip mall on Buford Highway. A folding table. A faded umbrella. Supplemental insurance policy packet stacked in front of him, his medical license framed in the back window of his car, where he could see it but nobody else would unless they looked carefully enough. Margaret studied the photograph for a long moment, then filed it away in the same drawer where she kept her own sealed service record. Some people get second chances. Some people disappear. Admiral Chen personally requested her as director of nursing at the Atlanta VA hospital. Margaret accepted. She walked into that office on her first morning at 7:05, before anyone else arrived, and placed the tarnished challenge coin on her desk, the one she'd carried since Tikrit, the one that had traveled through for years of Seattle General's hallways while she wore invisibility like a uniform. The worn surface caught the early light. She left it there. Emily came by after school, eyes wide at the office, at the title placard on the door, at the way staff greeted her mother differently now. Not with the careful politeness of someone they'd never understood, but with the recognition that moves between people who know a truth about each other. "You're really a soldier, Mommy?" Emily asked, standing in the doorway. Margaret knelt down to eye level. "I was. But I'm a nurse now." Both things. Both things at the same time. Chen stopped by that evening. They didn't discuss Tikrit, some operations stay classified, some stories belong only to the people who lived them, but he nodded at the challenge coin on her desk. "You kept it." It wasn't a question. Some debts don't expire, Master Chief. He smiled slightly. Neither do the people who paid them. 9 months later, Margaret saw Caldwell one more time. Outside that same strip mall, folding table being packed up in the rain, umbrella sagging. He was on his phone, arguing with someone, his voice carrying the particular desperation of someone who'd learned too late that the people you step on the way up don't forget you on the way down. She drove past without slowing. Felt nothing, not satisfaction, not pity. Just the steady recognition that the hospital had been protected from him, that the patients would be safer, that the system had eventually, worked the way it was supposed to. She arrived at the VA before dawn the next morning. The challenge coin was on her desk, catching the first fluorescent light. A young nurse, former army medic, nervous energy, the kind of person who noticed things, stopped by her office with a question. A physician had ordered something questionable, something that didn't match the patient's presentation, something that felt wrong. Margaret listened, reviewed the chart, then picked up the phone. "Doctor, I need to discuss this treatment plan." Her voice was calm. Steady. Absolute. Not asking. Stating. The resident on the other end started to push back, then recognized something in her tone and stopped. They talked through the clinical reasoning. The order was modified. The patient received appropriate care. The young nurse watched, learning. Seeing that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. Seeing that speaking up, speaking clearly, speaking with authority grounded in knowledge and experience, that was sometimes exactly what patients needed. That was sometimes exactly what the system needed to keep itself honest. Margaret closed with the lesson she carried from Tikrit to Seattle General to hear, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The young nurse nodded. Understood. Would remember it. Margaret's hand rested next to the challenge coin, her scarred fingers steady as they'd always been, ready for whatever came next. Ready to protect the vulnerable. Ready to speak when silence meant someone would suffer. Ready to be visible now, in a way she'd never been before. If you've ever been invisible in a place where your skills mattered, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, if you've ever had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up even when it cost you, subscribe, like, and let me know in the comments. Margaret's story is real for so many people. And sometimes the ones who transform systems aren't the ones who shout the loudest. They're the ones who knew all along what they were capable of.